time you convert something, you have a chance to introduce error. So we want to make sure that we've sort of eliminated that potential source of error as well.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Table 2 is probably the one that we would use the most at waste facilities. And we've discussed this a lot, but I wanted to kind of share it with the group here. So a lot of waste isn't something that you can scoop up and put in a beaker and send to a lab. A lot of the industrial waste is actually what we call pipe scale. So it's found in boilers and things like that, and it's hardened onto metal. So trying to get an activity per gram is obviously not something that's feasible or easy to do. And in the case with medical waste, right, a lot of times it could be radio iodine 131 and kitty litter or adult diapers. Now, I personally do not feel like digging through waste and finding the diapers and grinding them up so that I can put them into a Marinelli beaker. It's not really what I would recommend for anyone to do. But what I can do is I can go to a facility and say, okay, this is where all the waste is. It's about this big, and point my detector at it. Say, this is your activity level. So for table 2, we would want more than just the radium, because that's not what I'm generally going to find when I go to these facilities. So we'd want kind of everything that's in use for the ones that are just activity.
Yeah, just to clear up, table 2 wouldn't change. What we're doing is adding a table 2A.
Okay, gotcha. Cool. I was going to say, don't take the rest of that away. I need it.
I'll get the slides back.
Let's get the slides back. And I just would note that, Hillary, thank you for that. Part of the value, you know, everybody on the rack, but we'll need your help looking at the information we present out and helping us think about the process that you would like to see and those procedures that might get included in a rule set that if health authority would be doing, or on delegation to maybe the landfill themselves or the waste generator, but under your authority plus our authority, making sure it's extremely clear as to what has to happen is an important part of this process as well. We've got more hands up. I think I saw Art. Art, yep. Art, go ahead.
Hi, just comment on your current table 1 and 2. You noted that Jim and the other gentleman talked about using the best science. Well, I can tell you that table 1 and 2 are not the best science. They are obsolete. And so what is your thoughts on replacing table 1 and 2 with values that represent our best understanding of dosimetry?
I think we're open to that conversation. We would need help from perhaps the rack and maybe you are to make sure we have that best information and update the tables accordingly.
That would be a great comment to put in. We're gonna, when we distribute this, we'll put the tables out there too. So you could provide a source, or if you wanted to tabulate stuff from this literature out there, then that would be something to consider for sure.
And Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, those tables originally came from NRC.
So
from the NRC decades ago, I believe, when the rule set was first written.
Yeah, one of them came from the NRC. One of them came from Oregon, an antiquated version of the Radiation Protection Services, I believe.
So I think there's a way to say yes. We would like to have the information.
That's
to look at that. I think. Okay, go ahead.
I don't know if you wanted to talk about lead 210 right now, or do you want to hold that off?
I see Charla's hand is open. I suspect she has a comment on this current topic, and maybe we'll circle back around to the lead issue after that.
That's fine.
That's all right. Okay. Charla, go ahead. Welcome.
You're muted, Charla.
Oh, I clicked it once and it didn't work. Sorry about that. I apologize. I had a meeting run late, and so I'm kind of playing catch up. And filling in some blanks for myself on what's happening here, but I did want to just jump in and just express Oregon Business and Industries perspective here. That I think that one of the things that, you know, you may be looking at is really related to whether or not you're regulating disposal, and we're really you know, hoping that this could look at public health exposure and look at what, you know, what those protective mechanisms are in place, and really be evaluating risk where people are. And I think the thing is that the way Odo evaluates norm, for example, is that it's kind of, you know, you could build a house on it. There's just, you know, your foundation and your wood floor between you and the radioactive waste. And I don't, you know, that is not what is happening out there. And so hopefully that is something that you could be taking a look at. This, you know, we're not finding, you know, naturally occurring radioactive material in, you know, in people's backyards. So I think there needs to be a real, just a look at what, you know, kind of just from the approach perspective and where exposure is going to occur. And it really is not, it's going to be, you know, very minimal, and there are protective mechanisms in place when we're talking about landfills. So again, apologies if I jumped into the wrong place here, but I was trying to play catch up. So thank you.
Thank you. And no, you're not, you're in the right place. That's exactly the right type of conversation and questions to bring up here. And I appreciate that. Charles, what you're referring to is the house examples and how the pathway exemption process is calculated in the current rule set. We're open to ideas around if there's other options to assess risk and exposure. I think it's worth having the assessment and the consideration.
Well, it's so the point being that really, if we're looking at the mechanisms in place at a landfill, that should be a very different analysis, and that the kind of looking at risk is just a completely different, you know, it's just a completely different analysis from an exposure standpoint. So it seems like Odo should be looking at that. Thank you.
I think some of the historical context of our rule set comes clearly through to me that there was land disposal and land spreading decades ago as a normal course of practice, or maybe not normal, but as an occasional course of practice by industries and businesses in the state, you know, 40 plus years ago. And I think the rule set reflects that time and place to a large degree. And it is part of this process is to consider whether that is still relevant today, and or how should there be a consideration for the types of assessment that should be done in the current rule set, right? I mean, really, it's the way to say we're open to these ideas and like to hear them all.
And I can't see the attendance list. Do we have anyone from DEQ on the meeting?
We do have our DEQ representative.
Because it seems like if Odo's going to be regulating landfills, we would need to come up with some kind of methodology for putting that in the landfill license and defining what that financial assurance, what that modeling is going to look like. And if that's something that RAC wants to pursue in their comments, you know, that's a consideration that would need to be made as well. And I don't know if DEQ's willing or able to share that responsibility with Odo. I mean, it's disposal has always been not our responsibility.
Jamie Jones, DEQ, I see you're on the line. I won't put you on the spot here, but we might look for your questions and comments on that concept that Tom just described. But if you have something to share now, please dive in.
Definitely. As soon as we see the draft rules, we'll definitely be able to, you know, see where DQ like picks up and Odo drops off. As long, my main recommendation would be that it be extremely clear in rule who is responsible for enforcement and like where DEQ comes in or doesn't come in, right? And that's all I can say today on that specific topic. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think we'd all agree on clarity and rules is an important goal. Shirley Weathers.
While we're
Yes.
on the top, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
While we're on this topic about risk where we are, I just want to note that we're talking about dangerous materials that last for a very, very long time. So from what I've heard from previous discussions, we've always kept in mind that what we're doing today or tomorrow is not the extent of where we need to be looking. So I just want to add that into the mix as we're thinking about potentially perhaps focusing at closer rather than farther into the future.
Thank you. It's a good perspective. Art, has your hand up again? What's on your mind?
Yeah, Max, I think you brought up something I didn't fully appreciate, and that was, you said when the regulations were originally written, it's for land spreading. Is that correct?
Well, that was part of the consideration, absolutely. Yeah, we know
Yeah.
a few examples where that's occurred in the state.
I think what they're trying to say with the landfill operators is that disposal in a landfill very different than land spreading. I mean, the way they're written, you can live right on top of the land spreading, and you wouldn't, you'd be within dose limits if you actually built a house right on land spreading. And the way that the calculations are done, it basically assumes the entire field. It's infinitely long as it is in depth, filled with this material. That's the way it's written. And so I think what they're asking is, and I think it's really legitimate, is no, we're not land spreading. The landfill operators, operating landfill is entirely different than land spreading. And I think that's a consideration they're looking for.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Art. Yeah, we understand that perspective. Let's see. Okay, that was Art's hand up. Through this conversation, it popped up to my mind, Hillary, you mentioned it, workers and worker exposure. And that's something that's been, it's not particularly in the rule set now, but thinking about, Hillary, you mentioned classification of workers as radioactive material workers, right? And sort of a class of employment that perhaps many of the people who are working at waste generating facilities right now are not of that classification or understand that that's what they might be working with. I don't know if that's the case or not. I guess it's a question to say is if there's a rule set that goes into play that allows for a reduction, well, has a reduction in the dose limit. Is there something around worker safety that needs to be considered here in our rules? Or is that something that's best with health authority that maybe just changes what you do?
Yeah, so if you're following public dose limits, you'll be following worker dose limits, because worker dose limits are a lot higher. Because the idea is that if you're a radiation worker, then you have training and understanding and know how to handle materials appropriately. So I know we have, so for example, Metro, they have a license with us, and we do training for them for their hazmat workers specifically. And this I'm not as familiar with, but I assume probably most hazmat workers at a waste facility have HAZWOPER, which is the hazardous material accreditation, but HAZWOPER excludes radiation training. So that's why we step in. So we specifically train with Metro as a licensee because they do get a decent amount of radioactive waste that they've been trained to properly isolate and set aside so that they can transfer it or allow it to decay in place. So if other facilities want it, they don't even have to have a license with us if they don't want to, especially now that we have that 90-day rule, that'll make life a bit easier. But if they do have workers who are going to be handling that waste specifically, it's a good idea for them to have, and this is where it gets tricky, right? If they're not a licensee, I can't require that they have that radiation safety training. But if they are, then I can. So it's a good idea for them to have that training if they are not a licensee. And we make them renew it every 3 years, but most facilities will do it every year. Hopefully
Okay, I
that
appreciate that.
answers your
Yeah,
question.
no, that's good. I mean, what I hear from you, Hillary, and maybe this is confirming what I thought was, it's not our rule set that deals with work. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't some unintentional change to worker training or worker responsibilities that would occur from our rule sets in a change in the future, but it sounds like
No,
it's
it
well
was
covered
more
with health
just
authority.
if a facility is receiving waste and they get an exemption pathway, if they get an exemption pathway, then you don't need to classify them a rad worker. But it was more, I was trying to get more at like that distance issue, right? So it's like the load comes in and you put it in a specific spot and nobody touches it and then it gets buried and you know workers are handling it, then it's fine. But I think it's really important to include workers with talks when you're talking about the public.
Thank you, Hillary. Jim, you got your hand up.
There we go. Well, it takes a while to get off mute and on the thing here. Sorry. No, I agree with Hillary. I would stop short of calling them radiation workers because really that's the goal for what we're doing here. So we don't have folks in Oregon dealing with low-level radioactive waste. But I mean, I think it really points to two things, right? Previously, the rule really envisioned something where you could just do anything on top of the ground with it, roll around in it, grow crops on it, and everything else. Really unlimited restrictions. And now we're talking about taking in effect, the protections that landfills have or exhibit with respect to these materials. And I think it's reasonable, one, to have at least some form of operations plan that Odo can look at and say, okay, you guys are paying attention, you know what's going on, and this works. And then some level of training that's associated with that, and a monitoring plan for that matter. I think all of those are great and really worth looking into and moving forward for sure.
Great, thanks, Jim. Anything else from the RAC members right now? See other hands that are up. We can circle back around to the lead 210 question. Art and Jim, call back on both of you to, Art, sounds like you had something to say about lead 210.
Yeah. Lead 210's a tricky one. And Tom, as you correctly pointed out, the dose coefficients are higher for lead 210 and its progeny than radium 226. The problem is lead 210 really, in terms of long-term, doesn't depend on the inventory of lead 210. It depends on the inventory of radium 226. As one of the previous callers said, you got to be looking into the future on this. And so the initial lead 210 inventory is going to be gone in 100 years. And that's what I think we're looking at, is regulate something that will make a difference in the future, and that would be radium 226. And you include the contribution from lead 210 in there, but don't regulate lead 210 per se, because it's going to be gone. One could make the same argument with radium 228, because that has a 5-year half-life, and it really depends on thorium 232, the presence of thorium 232. So these are, I'm just presenting this as something food for thought here. But that's really, you know, in terms of long-term, the lead-210 inventory is really not the issue. It's the radium-226 inventory that's going to provide it in the long term.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And in the past, the rules have included lead-210 under the uranium standard, which is 10 picocuries per gram. What we found is that there are some wastes that are enriched in lead-210 that don't have the parent, they don't have the uranium. And so that's where the extra call out for lead-210 specifically comes in. It's when it's not in equilibrium. So yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying there. And our rules do cover lead-210 when it's in equilibrium with its parents. So that would be sort of the forward looking.
Now I lost. Go ahead, Jim. Jim, were you going to talk?
Yeah, I mean, my side is from the generator side really is, you know, it's really, really hard to measure lead-210 accurately, if at all, with gamma spectroscopy. And as you know, Tom, Max, and Max, you know, a lot, probably 50% or more of the pathway exemptions that we request are for lead-210 because it's really not measured accurately. And then when you go through the current process, it's not an issue even at high levels because it doesn't leach out. So the go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
Just to say, it does seem that when there are other norm constituents present, lead-210 can have some interference with the analytical. But out of the 200 to 300 lab results we've seen, maybe 1 or 2% has a detection limit issue for lead-210, which builds up over time, and I'm sure that is not an insignificant number. But it could be that a resample might suffice there as opposed to a full pathway.
I guess though on that, that was the other thing I was going to say. I mean, lead-210 is not easy to measure. And okay, so what is the risk from it? And I mean, unless somebody, I could understand if it's being released directly to the public right now. But in a landfill, nobody's rolling in it or anything. No one's building houses on it. And then, so you come to the question of, okay, what is the long-term risk? Well, that's going to be driven by the presence of radium-226. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. Even if you had 100 picocuries per gram of lead-210 and 50 picocuries per gram of radium-226 in the 100-year time frame, it's really driven by the 50 picocuries of radium-226, not the 100 picocuries of lead-210. I would point out in the ANSI standard, I worked on that for the Health Physics Society. They kind of came to a similar conclusion that lead-210 was definitely an occupational issue, especially dealing with natural gas pipelines, which can accumulate lead-210 and quite a bit. That's where the issue is. It wasn't in the landfill disposal part of it.
And that asks a good question as to, how the pathway exemption would live with the property in perpetuity if we were to allow credit recovery. What type of what monitoring frequency will we have to do to ensure that there was still appropriate cover, and for how long? And what type of financial assurance will be required there? A whole bunch of threads to pull if that's the way that the rules go.
I can appreciate that, and I think that's where the rubber will really meet the road. And I also don't think you want to do a full, I mean, if you looked at all the protections in a landfill with burial depth, there's virtually no exposure, but you want to And this is, almost a rhetorical question, how do you want to protect that and what assurances? So if you have a fairly conservative model, that overestimates risk, does that provide the protection you're looking for? And it simplifies it too.
Thanks, Art. Jamie?
Hi,
Go
yeah,
ahead,
just to throw, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Excellent. So I guess when we're talking about landfills, I think we seem to be talking and thinking about these as, like a landfill that nothing ever happens to the waste. And one of the things I don't want to throw another wrench or, get too off topic, but depending on the type of waste, where it's disposed, landfills do have things like that are like gas collection systems where you go back into the waste mass, you dig it up, you drill into it. And one of the ways, and I'm seeing this kind of being similar to asbestos, right? We don't want people drilling and, placing loose asbestos material in a big pile while they're drilling for a well, right? And so, the landfills generally in most states have to identify where asbestos is disposed. And then when they're doing their well installation, they have to avoid those areas. And I think that is something else that should be considered. Maybe that's a DEQ thing, maybe it's an ODO thing, but it is another piece of the puzzle that needs to be part of the conversation. And not all landfills are operated the same way. We do have very small landfills out in Eastern region that don't have the same like cover requirements, like daily cover requirements that because they're so small that are required at the majority of the larger all of the larger facilities. So I wanted to put that out there and make sure that, when we talk about landfills, until they are permanently closed, there could be some exposure issues and other things we have to keep in mind. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. What are the current regulations, Jamie, for landfills post-closure? How long is there a set period of time in your typical licenses for monitoring at the landfills post-closure?
So once closure is completed and certified, and we generally have a 30-year post-closure care period. Under DEQ regulation, however, if there are still significant public health impacts that, DEQ can make the case, hey, we can't, stop looking and testing and monitoring this landfill because, there's still like groundwater, we still have pumps running, or there's still issues. We can keep the permit open until those go away, which every situation is different. Every landfill is different. Sometimes we close them early. There's no issues and people are able to shut off all their pumps and take out all their gas wells. And I'm getting a little bit off the topic, but yeah, so the standard is 30 years and that can be extended if there's issues that present themselves and, the closure didn't go as planned.
Yeah, thank you. No, it is on topic because I'm just trying to understand what current management system exists with DEQ and landfills and landfill operators, just to keep that in mind as a consideration.
And yeah, so one of the other things that was brought up was time and distance and keeping the public away potentially being an option. And, I'm trying to like, a lot of landfills have these concepts, right? When they're going into closure, they're like, okay, this is the planned use of this property after, the land after these 30 years, or even within those 30 years, we're going to make this into, we're going to put down an extra 10, feet of soil and make it into a shopping center or something, right? Depending on the landfill and what that landfill is proposing, you know, maybe deed restrictions of some sort, specific locations for this waste to be disposed of, but there are complicating things that could, sometimes these places are parks and the whole place becomes a park, right? And so then the concept of distance, time, and public not allowed in that area, I guess we just need to be, there's a lot of things, and Jim's more of an expert on this than I am, so yeah,
Yeah,
but
I mean, you're just talking sort of the administrative controls that you might have in place at a post-closure
Right.
site or cleanup site. What does that look
Right.
like in the future? Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, Max, I agree with Jamie. I think the post-closure care portions of the DEQ permits are very complementary to, what we're talking about and what we're envisioning here. If the landfill basically becomes inert, and what that kind of means to me is it's not producing landfill gas any longer. There's no biologic activity happening that produces landfill gas, and it doesn't produce landfill leachate any longer if it's not producing landfill leachate. Then all of with the exception of all of our facilities, I'll speak for waste management, have requirements for deed restrictions on each of those landfills. But if it's not generating leachate, we don't have a groundwater potential issue. If it's not generating gas, we don't really have an air potential issue. So I think they're both complementary, I think is what I'm trying to say, is that, is a DEQ reserves the right to, it's a minimum 30 years, or unless we can prove that it's basically inert. So I think they're complementary. They would support each other.
Jim, I'm curious, what is your current deed restrictions on, do you know this off the top of your head for your facilities in Oregon?
So the deed restrictions typically say that, depending on the facility, they're, as Jamie said, they're all kind of different, but, you can't do certain things. You can't, put something on the facility that will damage the cap or the cover to allow leachate to go in. You can't do certain things. It's really for, I don't think it's ever happened. Well, maybe it has in some of the older landfills, but certainly in none of our landfills. It's not like, okay, we're done with the closure period, we're now gonna make this, we're gonna sell this property. So the deed restriction is really, there are certain things you can do, there's certain things you can't do. And oh, by the way, this was a historic landfill, and pay attention to that when you buy this property. So
Hillary.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to just discuss a couple of things that have been coming up. So one thing I want to make pretty crystal clear to the group is the levels we're talking about aren't even what we would consider low-level radioactive waste, right? So if it falls into that low-level radioactive waste, that cannot be buried in Oregon. It has to go to a different facility. So these are all levels that are below that. So low-level waste has a pretty low standard, or like basically a low baseline, I should say, of what's considered low-level radioactive waste. So everything below that is kind of what we're discussing here. And generally, and I would say especially like say in the case of lead, the bigger hazard is the other hazard, right? Lead is the bigger hazard than the radioactive side of lead-210. Outside, and as a general rule, if you don't ingest it or inhale it somehow, the radioactive materials are not going to affect you, especially in such low levels, right? Because we will never see these huge, massive doses being disposed of in Oregon. Because one, we see them right away. If they're really big, right, we're going to know. And these are very, very minor levels that we're talking about. So in the case of something in the future, and this is why it's important to have these records and keep track of them. And one of the things that we're currently in partnership with Odo right now is a facility that is trying to get their land cleared for use that used to have radioactive materials on site. So we do actually have a process. It's called MARSIM. It's the multi-agency. I can't remember the rest of it. I apologize, but essentially it's the NRC, EPA, DOE all got together and created what we call release criteria. So if there were facilities that had stuff disposed and they wanted to release it for use, we already have a program in place that you can use to test and make sure it's safe for other types of use. For our DEQ folks who probably have gone through it when you're working with Superfund sites and things like that, that's essentially what it was created for. So obviously a waste facility wouldn't be a Superfund site, but it could definitely fall into that category where we would have a procedure that we can use to release it for public use. And that's probably the way that we would suggest from RPS, Radiation Protection Services, on how we would want to go about releasing it. And it's nice because it's very well established and they just revised it about a year or two ago. And then the other thing that we might want to take into consideration, and this is another thing I've discussed with Odo, is the length of the half-life. Because most of the outside of norm and T-norm stuff, most of the stuff that is used in industry is not very long-lived. And so for people who are active users of radioactive materials, we have an allowance in their license that they can hold on to radioactive materials that they're no longer using to decay in place, or decay in storage is what we say, as long as it has a half-life of less than 120 days. Because essentially what you're saying is that it's going to be gone in 5 years. So that's another thing we could potentially look at for an exemption pathway is, well, what is the activity? What is the half-life? What is the potential exposure and harm to people? Do I think people are going to go out there and start, planting things and, digging up dirt within 5 years? Those are things that you would want to consider, because really, sorry, this is going on long, but like I said, the real hazard from radioactive materials is ingesting them at low levels such as this. So unless
You're talking really medical waste.
A little bit, yeah. Medical waste definitely is a big one. But there's other industrial applications that use radioactive materials that aren't long-lived. And so, it's just other things that we can consider when considering exemption pathways is the half-life. Because that's, again, a process that's already in use. If it's less than 120-day half-life, that's something that we can deal with and have allowances for.
So I just want to do a thought experiment here. So none of the waste that we're talking about would be considered low-level radioactive waste federally, right? So, but this rule establishes what is radioactive waste in Oregon. So you could have a waste that is considered radioactive waste in Oregon unless it's thrown into a landfill. So what is that waste called? Is it, and does the deed restriction on the landfill need to say, if you dig into this and put it on the ground, it's radioactive waste? How does that work? I mean, I think this is a great discussion, and I just, as someone who's going to have to be enforcing and interpreting these rules, I want to make sure that this type of stuff is what we address when we're writing them. So my successors down the road, 100 years from now, can understand that this material that was disposed in 2025 is radioactive waste if you dig it up and put it on the ground, but it's not radioactive waste if it's undercover in a managed landfill.
So, like you said, so that's the federal the federal definition of radioactive waste is what I'm discussing, because it's very clearly defined what is considered low level.
Hillary, what is that? Can you share with the group? What is that?
I will search it and I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. Thank you.
But I would potentially call it exempt. Because if we are putting it in the ground and it's different from our memorandum, then we're making an exception for it, right? But I would not call it low level waste.
Yeah, it would have to be situationally exempt though.
And that's fine, but you could, but that's how I would classify it, because I think if you call it low level waste, if you talk to anyone outside of Oregon, they're not going to know what you're talking about, because we have a different definition than the rest of the country does. And I think that could really lead to a lot of confusion.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. Jim, it's like your hand is up.
Yeah, Tom, that's a really good thought process. I mean, I think what we're all searching for here is kind of what's safe, right? Based on risk, right? Based on risk of the air, risk to the worker, risk to leachate, groundwater, those kinds of things. And I think, you know, in 2022, we have some pretty good guidelines now on what risk factors, I mean, are out there that really shouldn't be exceeded for certain user groups. That's not the right term, but certain peoples, right? And that's this idea of, what the heck is this called? Art, you were looking at this.
Derived concentration.
Derived concentration.
And
Yeah.
they're similar to what your table 1, 2, and 3 values would be, but they just represent the latest dosimetry. Those table 1, 2, and 3 values are really old stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think those derived concentration standards, I mean, they're pretty extensive. But
yeah, that is a complete list. Hillary, I think you had some concern. You know, don't leave off my medical isotopes. Well, that has everything.
Yeah.
All 800 and some odd radionuclides in it.
Right. I mean, that's a huge list, and you know, we are more or less looking at norm and T-norm and medical derived materials, but that's a really good kind of basis for what's not, certainly not low level, but what the exposure risk to people groups are, and maybe that's the kind of thing that we're searching for. I'm not sure.
Be clear, the pathway exemption only applies to norm and T-norm.
That's
The
correct.
quantity exemption would apply to medical waste.
Correct.
Yeah, I think as far as, you know, the landfills are concerned, we're mainly concerned with norm and T-norm. But I think what Hillary's concerned with also is a medical waste on top of that.
Oh,
Yeah,
there you go. Go
mostly
ahead,
just
Art.
'cause
Sorry, we
about
lost you
half
for a
of
second
my-
here.
Okay.
Wait, what's that?
I think they wanted us to pause.
Oh, okay.
We can hear, we can hear you now. You're
Okay.
playing. Hey, go ahead. We had a technical difficulty for 1 second, but we're back on now.
Yeah, so for me, I would say half of my calls are medical waste. And that's why it's nice with Metro, because we do already have a license in place and agreement with them, but it's more difficult for facilities who don't have a license, and being able to hold it on site because they know it's going to go away in 2 months. Or just with that knowledge that it'll be decayed within 2 months, that they can just bury it and not have to worry about it. Those are things that our office would really like to see, because now you're reducing exposure to everyone, members of the public and workers, with the knowledge of this is going to be well below, like I said, it'll be decayed away within 2 months, so you don't even have to worry about it anymore. So that's why I keep bringing up the medical waste side of it. So I'm obviously not talking about cesium or cobalt, that kind of medical waste. That is a whole different ballpark. And again, those are things that we track and we can keep care of on our side of the house for regulations. It's more this stuff that can potentially get out, which is norm, T-norm medical waste for diagnostic issues.
So stuff like I-131, yeah,
Yeah, like
other
so iodine 131 has a half-life of like 8 days.
8.0. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's
I'm
gone
sorry,
from
I got that one memorized.
Yeah, I have it memorized because I deal with it all the time.
Right.
Tech is the other most common one that has a 6-hour half-life. That's gone very, very quickly. Should never see F-18 because that has like a 2 or 3-hour half-life. So things like that. That's kind of what
Yeah,
our office has
that's
been dealing with.
definitely kind of a different issue than the
Right.
norm penal.
Definitely, but it is something that still would fall under waste. And
I think it's a
having
different
full
issue, but it's
effect.
part of this rulemaking, and it's worth, it's become an issue. Well, not become, it is something to consider in this rulemaking for sure.
And especially under the 7-day, fixing the 7-day rule. If you make that 90 days, then a lot of that issue goes away because if there is a temporary staging area for that medical waste, you can document that it's reduced in activity over this time and, make a case why it could be disposed. But if you can only hold it 7 days, then you can't observe that half-life.
And that, like, help me understand, with the experts on the call, something like iodine 131, it decays quickly, but is there a risk to anybody being exposed to that material in the short term from workers or anybody
Yeah.
else?
It's actually a lot safer for all the workers if you can just bury it right away. So, because the way that iodine works is it gets attracted to your thyroid. Because the point is it's for folks with hyperthyroidism. And so it's used generally in older adults and cats because they also get hyperthyroidism. And if you're handling this waste, then you have that potential to accidentally inhale it or accidentally ingest it if you're not wearing the proper PPE. And just having it kind of sit there, right? The bags are going to kind of get gross and decay and everything. Then you have to scoop it up and throw it away. So it's actually less of a risk to all parties involved if you can just dispose of it right away. Because your thyroid is very, very sensitive to iodine. And so it can be a risk to workers.
Okay, so that might be a subset of the rules we put a lot of thought into, how that process would look and what we would need to do to be confident that the isotope is one of the short-lived medical isotopes, how to document what that looks like, and then how to safely manage and dispose of it. I hear you, Hillary, but we want to make sure that we're doing right by our, our processes and making sure we have confidence in what is being disposed of, so to speak.
Because I know, sorry to keep going on.
No, it's worth it. Let's have a conversation, right? If this is one of our issues, let's talk about it.
Yeah, we had a recent facility down in Southern Oregon who got a load of iodine from a transfer station, so they couldn't return it to a hospital. And unfortunately, since they didn't have anybody on site who knew what to do with it, they had to dispose of it through low-level waste company, and it cost them a lot of money when it really shouldn't have, because ideally they could have just isolated it, put it to the side, and waited for decay rather than having to pay a company to come box it up and take it away, because iodine is very well known and it's very easy to identify.
But even aside from, just play out another scenario to interrupt you, is even aside from isolating in the side of the facility, you're suggesting once you have confidence it is iodine 131 or something similar, to just put it in the landfill.
Yeah.
And not set it off to the side, that would actually put it in the landfill where it'd be covered with other cover material.
Yeah, because it's not just iodine, right? In that bag is likely either human feces or cat feces. So that in and of itself isn't great to have sitting around, right? So you have a biohazard waste and a radioactive waste. So neither of them are great to just have hanging around when you could very safely dispose of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, any other thoughts from members of the RAC? We have some members of the RAC who haven't spoken up. I want to make sure everybody has the opportunity and the chance to speak up on any of the topics here or anything else we haven't talked about. If there's anybody who hasn't said anything, please dive in.
This is Andy Lombardo, and I've taken copious notes, and I'll respond in writing through the rack.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Anybody else that hasn't had a chance to speak up? Emily, haven't heard from you, not to call on you. Commissioner Shannon.
No,
I see you
you're
as
fine.
well.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Very good. I see Commissioner Pat Shannon is on the line. Wayne Lay is on the line too. You don't have to, but I just want to make sure everybody has the space to have something to say.
This is Commissioner Shannon. I'm good, just learning as we go.
Wayne? Next. And did we freeze up? Did we lose it? We got connection?
We're back.
We're back? Okay. That's a bandwidth.
Yeah.
You can hear me okay? Oh.
Yeah, I can hear
You're
you.
live? You can hear me, Jim? Okay.
Yeah.
So with that, I think that pathways and the options slide is not a decision point today. What that slide was getting to is a decision point, perhaps at some point in the future, maybe after the next RAC meeting in particular. But the plan, as Tom Cecilia, maybe I'm just reiterating what Tom mentioned here, is the plan is for us as staff to put out a draft of the rule set. And really, it's going to be a draft with red lines and things for consideration. It is in by no means anything more than a draft for staff's for cut at what we're hearing and what we think our options might lie. Open it up for contribution by the RAC, for wholesale suggested rewrites by the RAC. That's okay. Full scope of what you might want to consider with that. We'll get back together at some point, in our minds, probably January timeframe to when the next meeting might be together, get together to talk about draft of the rules. And at that time, at least in my mind, is when we would look at what these options that are on the slide right now, and if we want to deviate from the pathway that we're on right now, which is really number one, which is to keep going. So that's, in my mind, where we're at. Anything else, Mike, Tom, Cecilia, sound right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Members of the committee, anything else? Shirley? I got your hand there. Yeah, go ahead, Shirley.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, so we are not in fact on the verge of opening up a public comment period. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Not yet. We're sticking with the RAC comment period right now, with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. The
And then-
public comments, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and then after that, a meeting in January. So we'll be looking at submitting written comments on the draft you're sending out, and then we'll have another meeting, and then perhaps public comment after that.
That sounds right. The public comment, well, yes, to confirm, Shirley. The public comment would come once we take a draft of a rule set to the Energy Facility Siting Council. Is when, unless there's a different alternative I haven't thought about. I think the charge of this RAC is for us as the committee, well, we're staff, but for you that are the committee, to put forward options for FSEC to consider, at which point there will be a full public comment opportunity for any members of the public who are not on this RAC, or for members who are on the RAC, of course, you're still members of the public, to speak directly to FSEC. And in fact, when these rules get to the siting council, there will be a public hearing in addition to written comment where people can go testify directly, presumably in person, to FSEC. But that's in the future. We're getting ahead of ourselves with that schedule, but that's eventually what would come with the rulemaking process.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the intention is in the next, probably before Thanksgiving, we'll distribute our comment matrix based on the survey responses and our red line. And then when we send out that email, we'd start the 30-day clock. And then if someone on the RAC needs more than 30 days, you know, we can extend that. But then we would sort of synthesize all of those responses and bring them to the January meeting. The tentative schedule.
Yeah. Any thoughts on the process here from the advisory committee? Sound good? Okay, I'll take your silence as acquiescence to our proposal. Well, there's time left, but I don't need to belabor if we've all said our piece and what we want to talk about here. Anything else anybody wants to bring up now while we're all together? Otherwise, the next step will be communication from Odo staff out to this committee, as Tom mentioned, with drafts of the rules for contemplation and consideration.
Sure.
Oh, Shirley, yeah, go ahead, please.
Did I miss a call for public comment on this call today?
No, you didn't. That is part of all RAC meetings, is to have a public comment opportunity for people who aren't on the RAC, who might be listening in and want to have something to say. How about we do that? Should we do that now? Looking to my rulemaking coordinator. Okay. I'm hearing that there is at least one phone number calling into this meeting. Anybody who's not on the RAC who wants to speak up and have a comment, now is your chance. Is there anybody who wants to say anything who's not on the RAC and wants to say something? Nothing? Oh, here we go. Public comment.
So, one person on the phone, you can press *3 to raise your hand or make a comment.
Okay, hearing none. Shirley, thank you for reminding me about that, by the way. I appreciate that. Okay. Hearing nothing from the public or from the committee itself, we'll end this meeting. And like I said, look for an email from Odo's team to this group within a period of time before Thanksgiving is our goal, and we'll go from there.
Thanks,
Thank
guys,
you,
for your
everybody.
hard.
Really appreciate your
Thanks.
time.
Thanks for all your hard
Yeah.
work, guys. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. And thanks for
Take care.
everybody
Thank
for
you, everyone.
joining in here. Right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.